The hallway felt longer than usual as Laura Bennett walked through her quiet suburban home just after sunset, the kind of evening where nothing special was supposed to happen, the kind she had lived through hundreds of times without a second thought, and that was why her guard was down, why she carried a folded sweater in her hands instead of suspicion in her heart, planning only to return it to her adult son Ethan before dinner, because the house was calm, the air warm, and life felt steady in that fragile way it sometimes does before it breaks. And as she moved closer to Ethan's room she heard voices, not loud, not careless, but low and close, wrapped in a soft laugh that didn't belong to a casual moment, and something in her chest tightened even before her mind caught up, because a mother knows the sound of her child's joy and also the sound of danger, and this was both, tangled together, and she paused at the door, meaning to knock, meaning to be polite as she had learned to be since Ethan came back home as a grown man finding his way, but her hand moved on its own and the door opened just enough to change her life, and what she saw was not shocking in the way movies make it look, not dramatic, not loud, but painfully quiet. Ethan sitting on the edge of his bed, shoulders tense, his hand holding another hand with care, with meaning, and across from him was Claire Morrison, a woman Laura had trusted for years, a woman who had sat at her table, laughed with her, shared secrets, a woman who was also married to Laura's husband, and the room seemed to tilt as Laura took in the small details too quickly, the way Ethan's face drained of color, the way Claire pulled her hand back like she had been burned, the way guilt filled the space where comfort had just been, and no one spoke because there were no words ready for a moment like this, and Laura felt something tear inside her, not anger yet, not shouting, but disbelief mixed with heartbreak, because nothing about this felt sudden, it felt discovered, like stepping into a story already written without her consent, and time moved again all at once, rushing forward as Ethan stood up too fast, as Claire whispered Laura's name with tears already on her face, as Laura remained still, the sweater slipping from her fingers to the floor, and in that silence Laura understood something she had never wanted to know. That betrayal does not always arrive with chaos, sometimes it arrives gently, wrapped in familiar faces and quiet rooms, and she backed away without screaming, without asking questions, because her mind was racing faster than her body could follow, memories crashing into each other, the family dinners, the shared holidays, the trust she had given freely, and all of it now felt fragile and false, and as she turned down the hallway her legs shook but she kept walking, because stopping would mean facing the truth too soon, and behind her she heard Ethan call out once, his voice breaking, but she did not turn around, because a mother can love deeply and still need distance to survive, and as Laura reached the living room she looked around at the home she had built, the photos on the wall, the quiet couch where she and her husband sat every night, and she felt the weight of a choice she had not made pressing down on her, knowing that nothing in this house would ever feel simple again, knowing that what she had just seen was only the beginning, not the end, and that the act she had caught was not just two people holding hands, but the moment when truth finally stepped into the light and refused to leave. The truth came out in broken pieces that night, not as a clean confession but as a rushed flow of words driven by fear, because once the door had been opened there was no way to close it again, and Laura sat at the kitchen table while Ethan stood across from her, hands shaking, eyes red, speaking too fast as if speed could soften the damage, explaining how it had started months ago with nothing that felt wrong at first, just conversations during family gatherings. Short talks in the backyard, small jokes shared when others were busy, moments that seemed harmless because they stayed within polite lines, and Claire had been kind to him in a way that felt rare, listening when he talked about his job struggles, his worries, his feeling of being stuck while friends moved forward, and she had understood loneliness because she lived inside it every day in her quiet marriage, and Laura listened without interrupting, her face calm even as her heart pounded. Because every sentence felt like a small cut, and Ethan went on, saying the messages started slowly, a check-in here, a late reply there, until nights grew longer and words grew heavier, and neither of them planned for it to become emotional, but it did, because emotional closeness sneaks in when people are tired and unseen, and Claire believed she was just being supportive, and Ethan believed he had finally found someone who saw him clearly, and Laura noticed how often he said we didn't mean to, how often he avoided saying we chose to, and when Claire finally spoke her voice was quiet but steady, admitting her marriage to David had been empty for years, not cruel, not loud, just distant, with long silences and routines that replaced affection, and she said she felt invisible in her own home, and when Ethan listened to her, when he asked questions David no longer asked, it made her feel alive again. And Laura felt a strange mix of pain and understanding because she knew that feeling too well, yet knowing did not soften the betrayal, and Ethan admitted they crossed the line the day they met for coffee alone, promising it was only to talk, promising themselves it would stop there. But promises are easy when desire feels controlled, and after that meeting they found reasons to meet again, always careful, always quiet, convincing themselves that secrecy meant safety. And Laura realized how deeply planned this had been, how many moments she had smiled through without knowing what lived beneath them, and the weight of that knowledge settled heavy in her chest, and she asked one question, simple and sharp, asking if David knew, and the silence that followed answered her before words did, because no one looked up, and Laura closed her eyes briefly, feeling the full shape of the loss take form. Because this was no longer only about her son's mistake or her friend's weakness, it was about the collapse of trust across every line of loyalty she had believed was unbreakable, and when David finally entered the kitchen later, drawn by the tension he could no longer ignore, Laura told him everything without drama, without raised voice, because she was too tired for anger, and David listened with a face that slowly emptied of expression, as if a truth he had sensed for years had finally been named, and he didn't shout or accuse, he simply asked for space, and that hurt more than blame, because it meant the damage ran deeper than emotion, it had reached resignation, and that night ended without closure, without forgiveness, without answers, just four people standing in the ruins of choices already made, realizing that intentions no longer mattered, only consequences did. And as Laura went to bed alone she understood that the hardest part was not what she had lost that day, but what she could never unknow again. The days that followed felt heavy and unreal, moving too fast and too slow at the same time, because once the truth was out nothing could stay still, and David stopped sleeping in the shared bedroom, choosing the couch instead, not out of anger but exhaustion, as if lying beside Laura required more strength than he had left. And Laura noticed how quiet he became, how his words shortened, how his eyes avoided hers not with blame but with sadness, which hurt in a way shouting never could, and Ethan packed his things the next morning without being asked, moving through the house like a guest who had overstayed his welcome, his footsteps careful, his presence filled with regret, and when he stood at the door with his bag Laura saw her son again instead of the mistake, and they hugged for a long time without speaking, because love does not disappear just because it has been wounded, and Laura told him to take care of himself, her voice steady even as her chest ached, and when the door closed behind him the house felt larger and emptier than ever, and Claire left town soon after, sending a short message saying she needed distance and clarity, and Laura did not reply because she had nothing kind or cruel to say, only confusion. And the space left behind forced Laura and David to face each other without distractions, sitting across from one another at the kitchen table like strangers learning a shared language again, and David admitted he had felt the marriage slipping for years but chose silence because silence felt safer than confrontation, and Laura admitted she had felt lonely too but believed patience was loyalty, and both realized they had been standing in the same emptiness without reaching for each other. And counseling began not as a fix but as a pause, a place to speak honestly without fear, and some sessions ended with hope while others ended with quiet drives home where neither knew what to say, and Laura struggled with anger she didn't want to feel toward her own child, with guilt for still loving her husband, with grief for a future that no longer felt certain, and nights were the hardest, because memory grows louder in silence, and she replayed moments she missed, signs she ignored, chances she never took, and yet through all of it she discovered a strange strength, because surviving betrayal required honesty with herself, and she stopped pretending she was fine, stopped carrying everyone else's pain before her own, and David, in his own way, began to try again, not with grand gestures but small ones, asking questions, listening without defensiveness, sitting beside her instead of across from her. And nothing was repaired quickly, nothing was promised, but something real began to take shape, fragile but honest, and Laura learned that love after betrayal is not about returning to what was, it is about deciding what might still be possible, and some days that answer was yes, and other days it was not, and both were allowed, and as weeks passed Laura realized that the hardest choice was not whether to forgive, but whether to remain open to connection in a world that had shown her how easily trust could break, and even without knowing the ending, she chose to keep her heart awake, because closing it would have been the only true loss she could not accept. Months passed and life slowly reshaped itself into something unfamiliar but steady, because pain does not vanish, it settles, and Laura learned how to carry it without letting it control her days, and she and David continued counseling not with promises but with honesty, speaking about disappointments long buried, about habits that replaced affection, about how love can fade quietly when people stop choosing each other, and some evenings they laughed again, surprised by it, while other nights ended in silence that no longer felt hostile but thoughtful, as if both were listening to their own hearts, and Laura stopped rushing toward answers, understanding that clarity arrives only when pressure leaves, and Ethan called every Sunday like clockwork, never forcing forgiveness, never defending himself, just checking in, sharing small updates. And Laura heard the effort in his voice, the humility, the growth shaped by consequence, and their bond softened into something careful but real, built on truth instead of comfort. And one afternoon a letter arrived from Claire, handwritten, slow, and honest, filled with regret but free of excuses, acknowledging the harm without asking for release from it, and Laura read it once, then again weeks later, not ready to forgive but ready to let go of anger that no longer served her, and she placed the letter away not as closure but as a marker of where she had been, and life outside the story continued. Neighbors waved, seasons changed, routines returned. And Laura realized the world does not pause for heartbreak, it simply invites you to live alongside it. And one quiet evening she and David sat on the porch watching the sun fall behind familiar streets, not holding hands but not distant either, sharing a silence that felt earned, and David admitted he didn't know what the future looked like but knew he wanted it to be honest, and Laura agreed, understanding that honesty mattered more than certainty, and she saw clearly then that betrayal had stripped away illusion but left choice intact, and she chose to remain present, to love without denial, to forgive without forgetting, and to trust herself above all. And as night settled in she felt something unexpected, not relief, not happiness, but peace, the kind that comes when truth is no longer hidden, and Laura understood that being caught in the act was never about that moment in the hallway, it was about the act of seeing clearly, of standing in reality without turning away, and whatever came next would be built not on lies, but on the quiet courage to keep living, loving, and moving forward with eyes open.